Hi, and welcome to Conversations on AI podcast session. So, our today's guest is an Emeritus Professor at Ulster University with a special interest in spoken language technologies and conversational interfaces, Micael McTear. Michael has authored several books, including Spoken Dialogue Technology, Spoken Dialogue Systems, and the Conversational Interface Talking to Smart Devices. His latest book, Conversational AI, was published in last November 2020. This book provides a comprehensive introduction to conversational AI. So, a very warm welcome to Michael on our podcast session today. Michael, can you give us a brief background about yourself and how did you become interested in conversational AI?
Yes, well, in fact, my interest in conversation goes back a long way. My PhD, for example, was on conversations between young children. So what I was doing there was looking at how children develop conversational strategies. If, for example, one of the children wanted something and the other wouldn't give it, how they would negotiate that with conversation. And I looked at that development over time. Well, then, as time went on, the next phase was actually looking at people who had difficulties with conversation. There was a little boy who had what we would now call Asperger's syndrome, and he had various disorders, not of actual speech. That was perfectly okay, and his syntax was okay. But when he was talking about things, he had a rather sort of strange sort of style, and I studied that, and there was a book called Pragmatic Disability in Children that I co-authored with Gina Conti-Ramsden. But then as time went on, I became interested in AI. I moved, in fact, from the linguistics department in my university to the computer science department. And in particular, in the way in which computers might actually be able to process and deal with language. And so that took me then really to my first book on that topic, which was called The Articulate Computer. That came out in 1987. Now, at that time, the speech community and the linguistic community were actually quite separate. And so the sorts of things I was talking about there were text-based systems. And it was only really until about the late 80s and 90s that speech became more reliable in terms of speech recognition. And then people started to develop spoken dialogue systems, which then took me to the book that you mentioned in 2004. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super impressive. Michael, like you've had a journey from actual experience of your conversations with humans, and then connecting it back to the technology. So that's really very impressive. I think it's really an honor to have you here. So I think as we move forward with your interview today, I have a really interesting question, which is what do you understand by the term conversational AI?
What I understand by that is really how we can use AI. That's some sort of way of simulating intelligence to engage in conversation. Now, really, there have been two phases in that, well, three, in fact. The phase that I worked on initially was in symbolic AI, where people developed rule-based systems. So, for example, if you were going to decide whether some utterance hadn't been understood, there might be different possibilities. You might not bother at all and just go on, or you might ask them to repeat, or you might ask them to clarify something. There are the different sort of things you could do. But these things would all be handcrafted. The designer of the system would predict what sort of behaviors were happening, possibly based on the confidence of the speech recognition. If they were very confident, they might decide not to try and clarify. And if they were very lacking in confidence, they might ask the user to repeat. But what happened then over time is people said, well, that's not very easy to do, and there's so many different contingencies. And wouldn't it be better to get a system that could actually learn from data? And so people moved on then to reinforcement learning, for example, where the system would learn on the basis of interactions with the user, but there wouldn't be any handcrafting involved. And then we now have the latest stage in conversational AI, which is using deep learning. So really, some people would actually only use conversational AI to refer to this latest paradigm of deep learning, but I would actually use it in a broader sense to refer to all the different ways in which different types of AI have been involved.
Yeah, that's nice. Like, I think that's a really a different perspective to conversational AI. Like, even at Haptic, we do the similar kind. We do follow similar kind of strategies to achieve that kind of level of understanding with deep learning and data and machine learning, so that the AI becomes really stronger and it understands what a user's intent is and tries to resolve all the queries. So that's a very different perspective, Michael.
Yeah, well, I find,
okay.
For example, what you were saying about understanding the input, I think really that has been vastly improved. In the old days, we had to write a lot of grammar rules, and they were always going to be a bit flaky, and you could never sort of have something that covered everything. But when you use classifiers now with machine learning, they're much more robust. But the other side of the coin, getting the system to decide what action to take and what to say, that's more difficult to do using deep learning, to my mind. I think there's still a lot of problems. And so the sorts of things you find, the machine says things that are quite ridiculous, totally nonsensical. And I think there we still have challenges. And I think some of the old-fashioned AI is possibly going to be of use still there to try and filter out the sort of responses that don't actually make sense or that actually are possibly even offensive.
Yeah, that's true. That's something that, that's an area that even everyone's looking to have a solution to.
Yeah, quite often that is still handcrafted in many systems using some of the tools that are available. I think you actually have some of those as well.
Correct. Okay, so I think moving on to the next question, Michael, how is conversational AI being used in current applications? Can you give some examples to this?
Yeah, well, in a lot of deployed systems, people are still using some of the older tools like Dialogflow and the Amazon Alexa Skills Kit and Microsoft Bot Framework and so on to develop the systems. And they use the machine learning for the understanding part of it, but quite often they still will use the more handcrafted way of developing the actual conversation flow. And so a lot of companies would then actually build their systems in that way. Now, when you take some of the larger research groups in the likes of Google and Amazon and Facebook, they're using full-blown deep learning to develop systems like Mina and BlenderBot and so on. So really, I think there's a bit of a discrepancy or disparity between what the ordinary companies are doing for actual commercially deployed systems, and then what these larger companies are doing in their research labs to actually try and push forward the frontiers of research.
Correct. Do you think these companies have, because they have large amount of data in hand, for them it is easier to have such systems in place? And for the ordinary companies, it is still a challenge to have that much of data?
Yeah, well, indeed, they have massive amounts of data. And I think the problem for smaller companies and researchers like myself is that we don't actually have much of that data to hand. there are some public available databases, but
Yeah.
we don't have those sort of large, not only the data, but actually the language models that they built from the
Yeah.
data. So when you think of things like GPT-3, for example, and all the parameters then that are developed within the system, yeah, GPT-3 had 175 billion parameters.
Oh,
And then the cost of actually training the system with that goes into the millions,
yeah.
so there is really a disparity really between what the big companies are able to do. It's all in
Yeah.
their hands now really at the moment. And it's much more difficult for the smaller companies and researchers in small groups or even working on their own.
Correct. Are they also dominating this area, the big companies?
Well, I think they are. It's ironic because when I first started doing this, people said, "Oh, that's a load of rubbish, really. You're not going to be able to talk to a computer and it won't understand you." And I was really a bit like a lone wolf, really, in the wilderness, sort of seeing this as a vision, really, of what could happen. And now it's all been taken over, really, by the
Yeah.
big companies. But there are lots of other companies as well doing things, and it's really fascinating for me to see that what I'd only dreamt of once has now become a reality. And
Reality.
my
Correct.
Alexa and Google devices in the home and the kitchen, and we have great fun with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think we'll just move on to another question, because I think on one question we'll have like lots of discussions happening. So yeah. So Michael, according to you, what are the main differences between rule-based conversation systems and systems based on machine learning and end-to-end learning?
Well, the rule-based systems are fairly brittle, really, and they take a lot of time to develop. And the trouble is, they don't really learn from the interaction. I mean, we as humans learn from interaction all the time, from our childhood onwards. If you're going to change a handcrafted system, you simply just have to go back and rewrite things and so on. Whereas the data-driven systems using machine learning, they actually learn from the interactions and can improve over time. So I
Yeah.
think that would really be the major difference.
Yeah. And which one is more preferable according to you?
Well, to some extent, I would think you need a little bit of both, actually, because um,
Okay.
there are difficulties with some of the machine learning ones that it's a bit of a black box. You don't know exactly what they're doing and why and so on. I mean, there's the whole
Yeah.
area of explainable AI, for example, that people are starting to address. And so, for example, if a system gives a funny sort of answer, we probably like to know why it said that. um, and at the moment, we can't really. It just comes out of the box.
Correct. Yeah, so you need a balance of both the rule-based and the data-based.
I think so, and I
Correct.
think people are moving towards that. I was reading a very interesting book by Gary Marcus and a colleague, and they were saying that one of the things that's missing really in the deep learning approach is the ability to have representations of what's going on. And I think most people in
Okay.
deep learning would agree with that. And the ability then to reason over those representations.
Correct. Yeah. Right. So I think now we should move on to your book, and I'm really interested in knowing, Michael, that what was your motivation for writing this book on conversational AI? Like, tell me more about your book and how did you go about writing this?
Yeah, well, I always feel it's nice to sort of bring things together. And I sometimes think even narrowly of just my own colleagues um, who are beginning to work in this area as well, more from an applied perspective in things like mental health care and so on, where
Yeah.
we have several projects where we're developing chatbots. And then I find, well, they don't know very much about the whole literature and the background. And so partly the book is I think, sort of directed towards people like that, really, to help them understand what conversational AI is all about, because there's an awful lot of talk about these things, but people don't really know what the background is. And
Correct.
then in particular, because all of the literature now is in the deep learning paradigm. And sometimes you find people are actually they're actually just reinventing the wheel. So they talk about certain things that actually people were doing way back in the 80s. Now, maybe not very successfully, and without the computational resource that we have available nowadays, and the data and so on, and the algorithms. But nevertheless, there were ideas that people were talking about then that I think ought to be brought out. And so the idea was to really cover both the sort of past, really, in conversational AI, and then how things have developed over time, and then to look at the very end at what the future prospects might be as well.
Great. That's amazing. I think we all should, write our experiences and share it with our own network and our contacts. But writing a book is like a really like a big decision for anyone, and I think this is like an amazing journey for everyone to know about conversational AI with your book.
Yes, and in particular, I wanted to make it fairly user-friendly, as we say. So it wasn't, some of the books you get are very, very technical, full of lots of
Right.
equations and so on. Well, that's actually not my background so much anyway. I was more in the symbolic AI in any case. But I wanted to make it that so somebody could actually read the book and understand it without having all of the mathematical background. So that was one of my motivations as well. I do have to say it's a lot of work, because nowadays there are dozens of papers coming out every week. So I would write something up, and then by the end of the week there were several new papers, and I had to then write things. And I got very useful feedback from my reviewers, Oliver Lemon and Debbie Dahl. And that actually gave me another 3 months of work to actually incorporate all their ideas in as well. But it was tremendously useful, and I'm glad now
that's amazing. I think, Michael. Like, that's amazing. You keep learning on an everyday basis with this kind of research and this kind of consistency in your work. Also,
Yes.
Michael, so from your first book that you wrote in 2004, the spoken language technology, how much do you think has changed in terms of technology till now, from 2004 till now, and what does the future hold then?
Yeah, well, as we've said before, it has moved really from the rule-based systems to the statistical data-driven systems with machine learning. I think the other thing is we've also said major companies are now involved. When I did the 2004 book, really it was research groups in university labs predominantly, really, but not the major companies like Google and Amazon and so on. Now there's these massive language models that are available for training systems. And the downside, as I've said, this is then prohibitive then for smaller companies. But I think then the other thing is that people have become interested in conversation design. It's really become, it's become a new career really for a lot of people. And I've been following a lot of the webinars and blogs and tutorials and so on that are on the web. And there's some fantastic work being done now, really. It's really good to see that that's become a profession now for people.
Yeah, that's like a niche skill that people are taking up these days.
Yeah, and I think it's actually very important, because the danger is that people that come from, say, the graphical user interface environment simply just think they can make a conversational system without really knowing how that is meant to work. And you do see
Correct.
some terrible systems really that are not really designed properly according to proper principles. So it's
Correct.
good that we actually have this as a recognized profession now, and that we have experts that can do that.
Correct. Based on your experience, Michael, can you tell me some of the best practices for conversation design?
Well, I think not necessarily trying to make it exactly like human conversation all the time, but I think one of the important things is to actually work out the flow of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so what people do as one of the best practices is to actually simulate conversations initially. You can either
Correct.
do it with the Wizard of Oz type technique, or simply just asking one person to be the human and the other person to be the computer. It's also possible then to study dialogues of previous conversations, of maybe human-human interactions, and possibly learn from those as well. But then moving on from that to actually mapping out the flow is quite a difficult task, really, because it can get very complicated, and you have to
Yeah.
really decide, do you want to keep this a fairly constrained sort of system, where the system keeps total control over the conversation, or whether you want to have it more open-ended, and that's I think
Conversation.
where the challenges lies.
Correct. That's great. I think I got some really good insights from you on conversation best practices. So,
Yeah, yeah.
and do you think that while creating conversational AI, do users feel is there a human or a technology behind it?
Yeah, you mean, does the technology maybe try to
So
fool
do they
people?
feel the difference? Do they feel the difference is what I'm trying to ask you.
Yeah, well, I think some people are fooled by the tech. I mean, there are these competitions like the Loebner Prize, where the actual idea of the whole thing is to try and see whether
Yeah,
people are not able to distinguish between the
human and a
computer
chatbot.
system. Yeah, and the human. In fact, I was honored to be one of the judges back in 2014, where Mitsuko actually won in that particular
Yeah.
case, and it was interesting to see how that actually worked. But um, that's okay on its own, but I don't think that's the main thing, really. I don't think systems should normally be doing that. In fact, Google now has the policy with their duplex system that they tell people that this is a computer that's talking to you,
Okay.
and so that people aren't actually fooled by that. Um, I don't think that trying to fool people is really, I don't think it's all that ethical, really, actually. And it's okay
Okay.
as a competition, really, to see if you can do it. But I think in the real world, you don't really want to be doing that. On the other hand,
Correct.
it's difficult to know how people actually judge these things. I have grandchildren who talk to these systems all the time, and in one case, it's Alexa, and another, our grandson, he talks to Google Assistant, and
Wow.
I'm not really quite sure whether they believe that's a real
Human
system,
or a chatbot.
real human being behind the thing or not.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like, yeah, like at one point we have just forgotten that are we really talking to a human or a system behind it. That's
Yeah,
really interesting.
um, and actually, one of the ways in which this has been useful is one of my grandsons. He has a learning disability, and in
Oh.
particular, his articulation wasn't very good. So
Hmm.
he found it difficult to get Alexa to understand him. But by trying harder and harder, he's actually improved in his
Great.
articulation, because he was motivated to try to get Alexa to understand. And and so that has actually
That's
helped him in his
amazing.
development. Yeah, yeah,
That's amazing. That's like you can really see the power of technology there.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Great. So I think okay, Michael. I have like one last question for you now. So at Conversations on AI, we invite various AI experts like you from across the world. Uh, can you tell me what are your predictions for artificial intelligence in 2021?
Yeah, well, I think these language models are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But even Facebook flagged this up in their BlenderBot that they thought that the improvements would not just come from larger models, but that other aspects would have to be brought in. And in fact, in their BlenderBot, they included different things like personality of the system, its
Okay.
ability to display empathy, and its ability to access knowledge. And in fact, BlenderBot was about blending these different things together within the deep learning environment. So I think there's going to be that, and where that might lead us to more hybrid systems like we were talking about before, where there's a combination of the deep learning and the symbolic approaches. As far as applications are concerned, I think companies are going to be able to use these systems more. And there's a lot of motivation now, in fact, with the COVID-19 pandemic, to actually develop these type of assistants for all sorts of things, customer service, for example, but also support things in social domains like healthcare and mental health
Yeah.
support, care of the elderly.
Yeah.
I'm involved now actually in a project with people in the EU and Japan, which is to do with active and healthy aging. And we're developing a virtual personal assistant that will help older people. And there's a lot of work going on in these domains now, really. So it's not just really sales and things like that. It's actually
Yeah.
things that are going to be socially useful.
Yeah. That's
At
so
the same,
inspiring.
yeah, and at the same time, there are lots of challenges there as well, because we have to deal with what the users really want and what's useful to them and what's ethical, and issues like privacy and so on have to be looked at as well,
Yeah.
because we take
Correct.
the data, but then how can we use it and so on, and safeguard privacy and these sorts of
Correct.
things.
Correct. Correct. That's good to know. Like, we are using technology for such good social causes as well. So,
Yes.
talking about that, Micael, which business areas or business verticals do you see AI to be, AI applications more in the near future? Like we spoke about elderly healthcare. So, are there any more such business application or social cause applications where we can see AI to be implemented in the near future?
Well, there could be also other things. I mean, the things, say, in legal domains as well. There's been some interesting work done on uh, difficulties that people experience when they've perhaps been disadvantaged in the workplace. There was a very good system developed called Spot, I think it was, that would take people through an experience that they had, and then try and advise them really what they ought to do before they go and maybe see the human resources manager. Um,
Okay.
so there are lots of situations where simulations like that, that are run by a chatbot, because it's not possible for people to be available to deal with these things all the time,
Yeah.
just as in the healthcare domain as well. There's a limited number of doctors and professionals who can deal with things. And so if we have a conversation assistant that can do this, but then equally in companies, when you're fielding questions about products and services and so on, we had another project that was more in that business domain, that we've just completed actually, and it was to do with what's available within a company and its products and so on, and advising people on what particular product might be suitable for their needs. So I think there's It depends on the technology, of course, being suitable for these things, and it is developing and becoming better. So I think there are lots of possibilities there, and we will see this in the next few years.
Yeah. Yeah, I think even we all are waiting for AI to be more powerful and more strong in the coming years. And as like you mentioned, not only to help businesses across the world, but also to help humans and to do more of such social causes and social enabling. That is like the real power of technology and AI to be seen.
I think so, yeah. And then education would be another domain, really, because
Yes,
there again,
absolutely.
and again, we've experienced this a lot during the COVID pandemic, that schools are closed, and
Yes,
uh, teachers can do so much online, but they can't really do everything, really. It's much more difficult. And again, if we
yeah,
had artificial systems that could maybe do a lot, that would be another
absolutely. And we
application.
have seen a lot of them also crop up due to the pandemic. That there are a lot of AI applications that are cropping up, and they are available to give educational help to children or to anyone who is in need.
Yes, yes, indeed. And language learning would be another application.
Yes.
Where you could spend hours chatting to an artificial system and improving the language
Yeah,
ability.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's it, Michael. I really had a really great session with you, and it was again, it was an honor to have you uh, as a guest here. Thank you so much, and yeah, thank you.